This is the third in our 6-part discussion series, which is generally called the China Challenge. Our aim in these conversations is to answer one really big question. How can and should India and the US respond to China's increasing assertiveness and growing global ambitions? So the format we're using for these conversations is what is our innovation and what we call as a deep webinar. These are thoughtfully curated conversations that brings together great panelists with discussants from diverse backgrounds. We would also like to see increased audience engagement, so feel free to pose your questions in the Q&A feature. Today, we've got two people who have an expert understanding of international trade and economic policy. From Hudson, we've got Thomas J. Duesterberg. Thomas is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, an expert of trade, manufacturing, economics, and foreign policy. Dr. Duesterberg leads project work on trade with Europe and China, reform of the World Trade Organization, global competition in advanced technology such as 5G, and the strength of US manufacturing sector. He co-wrote US Manufacturing, the Engine of Growth in a Global Economy, and 3 other books, and is the author of over 200 articles in journals and major newspapers. Welcome, Tom.
Nice to be with you.
Great. From Takshashila, we've got my colleague and a sort of mentor, Narayan Ramachandran. Narayan is the co-founder and fellow at the Takshashila Institution. He was previously the chairman of RBL Bank, and before that was the country head of Morgan Stanley India, leading all of the group's businesses. He's worked in Wall Street for over 20 years. He's also on the board of several entrepreneurial companies and foundations. He writes a fortnightly column titled A Visible Hand for Mint newspaper. A series of these articles have been put together in 2 books. Welcome, Narayan.
Thank you, Anupam, and delighted to be here with Dr. Duesterberg.
Joining them are our 3 discussants. Ramya Nair is the senior associate editor at The Print. Antara Ghoshal Singh is a research associate at the Delhi Policy Group. And my good friend and ex-colleague Devika Kher is pursuing her master's in public policy at the Harris School of Public Policy in Chicago. So these are broad introductions to everyone present as part of the panel. Let's just get on to the topic. Today, we're going to discuss and look at whether an economic divorce from China is possible. And what does an economic divorce even look like, whether it's possible, whether it's feasible, and whether it's desirable. So we'll get into all of these questions in much greater detail. But we have to realize that the world was heading towards greater protectionism even before COVID-19 pandemic burst onto the scene. Now, the United States and many other countries have called for a restructuring of the global supply chains at a time when many companies are moving out of China, or at least are threatening to do so. What does the future of trade look like? And will this result in a drastic reconfiguration of global supply chains? We'll discuss all of these with our 2 panelists and our discussants. Tom, I just want to start with you, and I want to get your opening remarks on the big question. Before we head on to China-specific policies and trade policies and so on, I want to get your impression of how the future of global trade will look like. Are we going to witness a prolonged period of protectionist tendencies, or are we going to get back to a phase of high growth in world trade and greater integration of markets? So let's just start with that opening remark, and then we'll get on to the specifics of trade.
Okay, thank you, Anupam. And I'm going to start by echoing some of your opening remarks here. The questions of balance and mutual benefits for the what became a fairly open trade system after the Second World War have been coming under contestation in the last couple of decades. The loss of industrial jobs in the US and Europe is one of the contributing factors to that. This can be seen in US politics. There's a bipartisan consensus, if you will, that the questions of imbalances and lack of reciprocal access have to be addressed. Of course, all of this growing problem, if you will, at least is perceived as a problem, and I think it is for economic performance, especially in the highly developed countries. It's all exacerbated by the rise of China and its mercantilist approach to global trade and to its economic development. Finally, the pandemic that we're all experiencing and trying to get over has reinforced these tendencies by interrupting supply chains and causing countries to increasingly look inward for the resilience is a code word, but independence, if you will, of supply chains. So all of these factors have contributed to increasing tendencies both in the West and in the East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, of looking more inward. This tendency to look more inward, I don't want to use the word protectionist yet, but it's certainly going to come up, is especially seen in the transatlantic core of the global trading system. The growth of sentiment in favor of national champions continues to increase, not only in Europe, but also in the United States and in Japan, where a program has been put in place to try to incent Japanese companies to return to Japan. Another factor in all of this is the importance of security considerations. Again, this is reinforced, if you will, by the pandemic, where almost every country in the world saw interruptions in supply of some key products needed to adequately address the pandemic. But it's also due to the growing conversions of consumer and military technology. Now, China is trying to become the Middle Kingdom again, with its dominance in manufacturing and economic colonization. I don't know what the better word is for that, of Central and part of Southeast Asia. It's going into Africa, it's going into South America. This tendency is helping to undermine the global trading system, because China clearly has a mindset of a separate sphere going back to the 19th and early 20th centuries, spheres of influence, colonization, if you want to call it that. The combination of the Made in China 2025 program, the Belt and Road Initiative, and now looking ahead, the new China Standards 2035 program are all part and parcel of this, this growing aggressiveness of China. Turning inward and increasing skepticism about globalization in US and Europe, which are, after all, the core founders of the Bretton Woods systems, is not going to go away, even after the pandemic, even after the recession hopefully will be behind us. There is, as I mentioned, bipartisan support in the United States for taking on the China challenge and an increasing effort to bring in allies in this battle, if you will. But I would say that the United States, despite some of the rhetoric of our president and sometimes our trade representative, Bob Lighthizer, sometimes our Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, despite that, we haven't given up on globalization. There was an interesting opinion piece by Mr. Lighthizer in the Wall Street Journal about 3 weeks ago, in which he advanced several proposals for improving the work of the World Trade Organization. And he bitterly criticized the Europeans for their, what he called bilateralism, which he harkened back to the colonial age of the 19th century. But I think looking ahead, the United States is going to make an effort to seek allies, to counter the Chinese, increasing Chinese dominance in the economy. A key to this, and I think we'll get into this in more detail later, is going to be making the World Trade Organization work more effectively again. This involves creating new rules to cover the Chinese challenge, including covering subsidization and the digital economy. I do think that we're going to see a move towards plurilateral agreements as the driving force in the global trading system. How much cooperation we can get from China, I think, will determine how far we go into devolving into two spheres of economic influence, or decoupling, if you want to call it that. I'm personally a little skeptical about how far China will go in working with the global trading system, but that remains to be seen. And finally, the idea of, in the United States especially, when we think about WTO reform, one always thinks of the appellate body. And what the United States, and I think other places like the UK, are critical of is the technocratic judicialization, if you will, of the World Trade Organization. And many in the United States, including myself, believe that we need to find ways to have more democratic oversight and use of negotiations to create new rules rather than leaving it up to a judicialized bureaucratic function in the World Trade Organization. So let me stop there, and hopefully this will provoke some interesting dialogue in going ahead.
Surely. Thanks for that. Narayan, I just want to bring you in here and just carry on from Tom's train of thought. We've seen great global integration in the last, since World War II began, as Tom mentioned, and especially the years, 90s and the 2000s also saw adequate flow of capital. There was greatest kind of movement towards global integration and globalization, I think. But since then, it's seen sort of full stops or commas or colons, depends on semicolons, it depends on how you want to see them. What we are seeing today because of the pandemic, how would you categorize that? Is that a ellipsis? Is that just a temporary stop? How do you envision the kind of future of trade? How will the evolution of economic interdependence look like?
So like Tom, but from a very different perspective, I think the future is going to be informed by the past in the same way that China informs its future with its very long past. I do think that the success of multilateralism and a rules-based trade order that we have seen since World War II has some useful sort of observations for how all the countries might proceed looking ahead as well. I mean, right now it looks a bit bleak, a bit like the San Francisco skies from yesterday. But I do think that one day they will clear up because it's in everybody's best interest. And if you think about the three sort of big issues facing the world, nuclear deterrence, which there has been some progress on, but has moved in fits and starts, sort of globalization in general through at least through the mid-90s, and then followed by China's big rise after 2001. Now followed a little bit by the opposite, which is globalization, if I can call it that. And then the third, which is climate change, where we've all agreed to agree and then disagreed. So these are, I think, the three major planks on which a multilateral global order will need to sort of rediscover itself going forward. Now, we're in that sort of pause zone where we are readjusting to this new thing with the old order having worked from the Bretton Woods period onwards. Just a quick stat on that, just to show that it was indeed very successful. Even though trade and global trade has been with us, at least back to the Greeks, perhaps even back to the Buddhists before that, the spectacular rise in trade, first from the period of 1947 till about 75. Then if you break it up into another period from say 75 to 95, And then with the ascension of China into WTO in 2001-2, there has been another dramatic rise. And the increase in global trade at a rate faster than global production has, has at least in part been responsible for lifting just a simple number of 1 billion people out of poverty. So something has been achieved since World War II, and the global multilateral trade system was part of it. Now, if you look into the elements of that success, as Tom alluded to, in the Marshall Plan and in the Supreme Allied Command in Japan, were embedded sort of political imperatives along with economic imperatives. And that is essentially why people work in a very aligned fashion for at least 30, 40 years before those alignments started fraying at the edges. And therefore, we need to discover a form of, and the Soviet Union, which, believe it or not, was actually an ally in World War II, stopped being so right after, and was not part of that system at all. So except for nuclear deterrence, the Soviet Union did not become part of the global trade system. In fact, Russia entered well after China, only a few years ago, 7 or 8 years ago, into the WTO. So I think it's important to sort of remember that the political negotiation process has to be embedded into a negotiations process. If you think of the 3 pillars of the WTO, and we can possibly get into the reform section of the WTO right away, one of the major pillars of the WTO is negotiation. And in that negotiations, that is done somewhat politically. But the other 2 sides, the transparency and then the dispute resolution side, that has become like a mini sort of European Union administrative organizations out of Brussels. And that's what I think everybody is protesting, those who are protesting sort of legitimately on the dispute resolution mechanism. China on its side has utilized the WTO very successfully. The critics would claim too successfully, and in some senses has abused and overused its privilege with respect to the WTO, which is why you're getting the backlash that you are getting now. But I firmly believe that the answer to Chinese expansionism, and I'm referring to expansionism very narrowly in the context of the WTO here. Of course, it could be used with respect to India's border as well, which is the subject of another conversation. But that needs to be reined in, but in the context of a different set of multilateral rules that work to everybody's benefit, where the disparity in the political system of China does not manifest itself as, subsidized competition, unfair trade practice, and so on. So I think the old adage that trade works best when it is reciprocal, when it sort of counts each other's interests, and 3, when it specifically involves fairness and balance. I think you need to bring in those elements. And fairness and balance, when you have different political systems, requires political negotiation. So I do, in summary, think that global trade is not going to get, and the slope of the curve is going to go down dramatically, as it already has done since 2009. And again, after this pandemic. In fact, the pandemic itself, the decline has been sharper than the decline in 2008-9. So, the 2 interruptions in the period 12 years ago and today have been quite severe. There's about a 30% reduction from the point it was right prior to the episode. And so it's going to take a while to come back. But even when it does, the rate of change is going to be much slower than the rate of change that we've had for the last 30, 40 years, ending, say, 2007. And that comes, I will stop with this, with your title, which is economic divorce. I think the word divorce is a little misapplied, because at least in the human context, divorce is bilateral. It's between spouse and the other spouse. Whereas in the context of trade, it, effectively a successful society is polygamous. And it is difficult to describe what divorce in a polygamous society really means without the society sort of falling apart. But it is possible to think that multiple partners in a polygamous society will actually have either a higher or low intensity of squabbling. And it's entirely in that sort of phase that we live in now. And if we reduce the extent of squabbling, which economists will call friction, or the cost of friction, that by definition improves both the quantity and quality of trade, which is essential to prosperity everywhere. So let me stop with that, and I can see Tom smiling already. So,
all right, thanks for that. And I think that's a useful analogy to go forward, but I don't know how much we can stretch that, or whether it's in the interest of the larger community here to stretch that any further. Just moving on to, since we're talking about this divorce, and since we're talking about putting China, or dealing with China, there's been quite a bit of chatter on companies moving out of China, and whether it's for hedging the supply chains or whether it is part of a political move, etc. And of course, the political establishment in the US hopes that they will land on the US shores. India has itself enacted a few reforms hoping to attract some of these companies. But however, we also know that there are a few predictions out there which says that firms might not come to either of these two destinations. It might just end up in countries with a similar or lower wage structure than China, and there's some evidence to see that that is happening. However, and I want to bring Tom in on this, on various forums and in some of the articles that you've written, you've discussed the complexities of global value chains and the role of these in economic and national security. So I just want to get your view on, do you see a restructuring of global supply chains beyond just labor and wage arbitrage? And what would be the role of the three principles, for example, that you mentioned and you emphasize, which is on reciprocity, national security, and democratic oversight? How do you see the restructuring of global supply chains?
Well, I do think we're seeing and have been seeing for a few years a slow rethinking of extended supply chains. Now, there is an economic underpinning to this. And let's, speak specifically of China. To properly understand the total cost of producing in a place like China, it's not just labor rates that one has to take into consideration, it's transportation costs. Unfortunately, in China, you have to take into account the occasional occurrence of cutoff of supplies of one sort or another, electricity, water. When the pollution gets too bad around major cities, they shut down factory production. So as much as 15 years ago, I was running a trade association, a research organization called the Manufacturers Alliance, which had devoted to the strength of the US manufacturing sector. And we commissioned a series of studies about the all-in costs of producing, especially in China, and found that if you properly take account of some of the political considerations and possible interruptions in transportation, along with all the capital costs and so on and so forth, that the China price was becoming increasingly less favorable. I mean, it was still cheaper, if you will, but not that much. And so all of that has been exacerbated by a series of natural disasters in the last 10 years, which reinforce the difficulties of getting products to market, but also the political considerations of dealing with China, including the theft of intellectual property. So there has been that tendency for a while. Now, what I think has come more into the fore in recent times is questions of security writ large. You know, there's a defense element to that. There's increasingly a consideration of, you know, medical products and health considerations, but also things like, you know, vulnerabilities of infrastructure like telecommunications or electricity. So all of these are contributing to rethinking supply chains. Now, to get to your specifics, the United States is clearly, as a political matter, under President Trump, and I don't think it'll totally disappear under President Biden, if, depending on the outcome of the election, finding ways to encourage US companies either to return home or at least to leave China. As we all know, supply chains in major industries, take commercial aviation, take heavy construction equipment, let alone telecommunications equipment or computers. Supply chains are very complex. It's hard to move them. There are lots of capital costs involved. So US business community, just to take one example, and you can probably reinforce this with the European business community, is heavily invested in China. Actually, some heavy industry in Europe and the United States actually making a lot of money in China. So business is reluctant to leave that behind, and it's difficult to do so. It takes years to build up supply chains. Semiconductor fabrication, incredibly capital intensive supply chains, you know, even things as simple as access to clean water in that industry, all are very difficult to achieve. So nothing is going to happen very fast, but there is, for the political reasons and the economic reasons that we've discussed, there is going to be a movement away from, at least away from China. The US will do everything it can to incentivize coming into the United States. The Europeans will do the same, but it's probably not practical for economic reasons for everything to move back to the developed countries. So what has happened, you know, in the last 5 years is Vietnam has benefited greatly. Mexico has benefited from moves in the United States. Eastern Europe, I think, has benefited, as in the auto industry, European auto industry. India, to a certain extent, has. I mean, Samsung moved some mobile phone production to India. Lots of issues with India that we can get into, and you guys know better than I do. But I think, to summarize, there will be movement away from China. It will be difficult to achieve total decoupling, although I think we have to look at the politics of that, which are favoring decoupling right now. But the movement will not be uniquely to the United States, uniquely to Europe. It will be distributed throughout the world, and you know, perhaps what we ought to think about is, you know, an ecosystem that is pretty broad. I know Japan, Australia, India have talked about, you know, a supply chain policy to promote that in that area. So let me stop there.
Just a very quick follow-up question based on just what you said now. You spoke about vulnerabilities, and I just want to know whether the ongoing kind of pandemic has that truly highlighted or exposed some of the vulnerabilities of, let's say, the US, but not necessarily confined to the United States, but even India and so on, whether it's pharmaceutical APIs or, you know, as you've mentioned in one of your testaments to regarding rare earth elements or minerals, you know, are there any vulnerabilities that the world faces in the sense that they're excessively dependent on China and it's not easily, that you can't find a substitute as easily?
Well, you hit on several of the major issues of vulnerabilities, and clearly medical supplies have exacerbated the problem and increased the visibility of the problem. I mean, in the US Congress, members of Congress are falling all over each other to find ways to subsidize the production of medical products, and this is bipartisan. I'm a little bit skeptical on the medical products front. India, for instance, is a major supplier of basic pharmaceutical products. I don't know the numbers of how much India has to import from China, but I'm morally certain that the combination of friendly countries and democratic countries could find ways to produce the medical products. I'm more concerned about minerals that are important to high-tech production. You mentioned rare earths, but if we're going to have an electric vehicle economy, China has systematically moved into Africa and South America to control the mines of cobalt, lithium, graphite, and manganese that are important to at least the current generation of batteries. So it's that sort of vulnerability that I think is really has to be addressed.
All right, thank you so much. That obviously gets a lot of food for thought. Narayan, just bringing you in, I have two interrelated questions, and we can keep this quite short. Which is, one, you've often spoken about the importance of trade for India's prosperity, and I think that's a given. I mean, as in, at least here, I think we would all believe in that. And you've also gone on to, for example, comment that India should lead the war against protectionism in one of your articles. So, how can this be done? As in, just to tie things together before I give space to the discussants, is WTO the way to do that? Should India, for instance, bat for a global rules-based order, and should, for instance, can this be one of the possible places where India and the US can fight together in establishing or re-establishing WTO as is that the way forward, or is there any other way that India can truly bat for a more global, open trading system? I know that's probably a big question, and I'm giving you like 5 minutes to answer, but yeah.
Yeah, it's not a quick answer, but I'll begin by saying once again that, listen, this global rules-based order did work after the war for many years. It did help India to some extent, China to even greater extent, right? It frayed at the edges starting about 15-20 years ago. It's sort of slowly fading, and the fade is fully manifest today. Now, some people believe that reforming an organization from within is very difficult, and therefore you should start afresh. But in something as complex as this, I don't think we have the luxury to start afresh. So we will really have to reform the WTO. And India, it's India's moment to benefit the greatest from a WTO. If you will, the rough spread in time between India and China is about 15-17 years, which makes it almost the perfect moment from when China gained WTO extension in 2001-2 till about today, for us to actually be the biggest beneficiaries of this, just given the demographic bulge and all of that good stuff. So I think it's in India's best interest to work with like-minded nations to reform WTO in such a manner. And this is the place, I think, where Tom wanted some divergence on the panel. I diverge slightly. I think, to use a very Asian term, China has behaved differently, but it cannot be given the pariah status, because that then says this is headed to divorce. Instead, you just have to hold the sacrament of marriage, if I could really push this far, and say we've got to figure out how the squabbling gets better. right? Of course, there's challenges, and there's fundamental value-based differences between what is avowedly a single-party socialist system and what is confusedly a capitalist system, right? So that difference in value system reigns, but we have to get our arms around trying to align those. And India, for instance, is a knee-jerk socialist country, which gets in the way of at least global trade every once in a while. So for instance, India propounding, not to be protectionist at a time when its first response to virtually anything is protectionist is not a useful sort of opening position to be in. So I think India needs to sort of embrace the open trade position, by and large, bring down tariffs. It is at this moment in time, if you multiply by magnitudes, the largest single beneficiary of open trade of the type that we had 15, 20 years ago. And therefore, it behooves India to work with whoever can work with them. The plurilateral and all of these others are great compromises, but they are compromises as far as India is concerned. It will be way suboptimal compared to a direct multilateral, multi-country rules-based system. And I do think China will eventually see the folly of its ways and somehow be corralled into a workable, if not a perfectly efficient, global trading system.
All right, thank you for that. I'm just going to get our discussants in at this moment. Ramya, can you make your interjection at the moment?
Hi, good evening. I just wanted to check, how does India's this new motto of self-reliance come into this? Because, when the pandemic started, we did start producing our own personal protection equipment. We did produce sanitizers. We did produce, ventilators. But then we weren't able to manage something as small as a sanitizer dispenser pump. And, at present, many, the entire MSME department in India is looking at exploring, tapping all of its R&D facilities to make this small item, which is costs like say rupees 5 to 10. But still, that seems to be the focus that no, India should not be importing this item, which we basically import from China. And we should try to produce this 50 lakh units that we need within the country. So does this call for self-reliance actually mean that we produce those things that we do not really excel at? That's my first question. And secondly, I wanted to ask, do you think that India was right in staying away from RCEP? Will this impact on how investors perceive India as an investment destination?
Anupam, shall I take the first question? Yeah, and then maybe I can get Tom to start on RCEP, but from the direction of TPP maybe. Your question has your answer, which is the complete futility of attempting to do everything yourself. It brings up the horrors of ghost paths like import substitution and so on. But even if that's not what they meant, unlike, for instance, the US economy, the Indian economy was not doing very well in 2019. So we were already in the hospital. And what we have done with this phrase and this political imperative that now needs to deliver on this somewhat promise to the people, if you will, is we've shot ourselves in the foot in the hospital. So all we've done is gone from the hospital into the ICU. It doesn't solve anybody's purpose. So India, as I said, is the greatest beneficiary of this global trade. David Ricardo and his fifth generation progeny still are alive, and nothing's changed with respect to Ricardian principles. And where the opportunity cost is lower elsewhere, we should get produced, particularly if it's a pump that comes from China, right? I mean, in particular specific instances, where it has defense-related implications, there's some debate. But in daily consumer goods, in even some B2B supplies that go on to make other things, this sort of bilateral demonizing doesn't help, at least from the point of India. First of all, bilateralism in trade is a huge problem. I mean, I was being facetious about the word divorce, but Trump is just dead wrong with zero knowledge of economics when he talks about a bilateral trade deficit. Ever since the Smoot-Hawley things failed, I don't know, 75 years ago, it should have been patently obvious to anybody thinking about trade that thinking about just the bilateral trade deficit is wrong. Even if you did that, you'd have to do it on a value-added basis. So for instance, if you take a TV panel going from China to the US, 75% of the real value of that TV panel comes from Japan or Korea. And only the last 25% is tacked on. And to say that 100% of it comes from China is just mistaking. So I think we will need to do a lot of nuance, scholarship and research to more understand the complexity of the supply chain, to an earlier question that Anupam asked. But for India, this self-reliance, where they confessedly say we don't mean self-reliance, is just a completely meaningless, confusing slogan at this moment. And I'll turn it to Tom to answer the second question about plurilateral organizations like RCEP, but perhaps you can start with TPP in case you're not that familiar with RCEP.
I know a bit about RCEP.
Oh, perfect. Then that's even better.
a bit, okay. But I guess I would go backwards. I'm just a little bit skeptical about the motivations of China and their willingness to participate in a constructive way, as what Zellick called a global stakeholder, a responsible global stakeholder. Hopefully I'm wrong, but the evidence that I've seen, especially in the last 10 years, tells me that they are determined to, be self-reliant. And by the way, I agree with your assessment of the stupidity of trying to be totally self-reliant. I've been a skeptic of China for a long time. Even though I'm viewed as a conservative Republican and think that way, free trader, I was against China coming into the World Trade Organization because I thought it would undermine the comity and the rules-based system. And I'm still skeptical about where they want to go. So from that perspective, I think India not participating in the RCEP was the right decision. Now, with regard to regional or plurilateral agreements, what I see and have argued is that a fundamental flaw of the World Trade Organization is the unanimity principle. And it undermined the Doha round, if you will. There were lots of reasons for that. But we have to, if we want to save the organization and make it relevant again, we have to find a way to move forward. And there are certain elements, technical elements of the existing WTO rules that allow plurilateral agreements. We had the example of the Information Technology Agreement, which you probably remember from the late 1990s. There are ongoing negotiations on digital trade and on services. And the WTO does allow agreements if a majority, and there's argument over this, a supermajority of global trade is covered by those who participate in the plurilateral. And one argument that can be made is like-minded nations that agree that we should move forward, in a specific area. Let's take digital trade because it's so important to the future. If they can reach an agreement, then it could be incorporated into the WTO corpus as long as it was open in the sense that other nations could join. So that's one possible way to move forward. And the TPP was not really conceived as a WTO compliant agreement, but it could possibly be transformed into that by making it open. It's comprehensive, so it's more difficult than, you know, most plurilaterals are going to be specific to a sector or a type of product. Anyway, I do believe that that's one way to move forward, and RCEP, I think, was undermined from the start by the participation of China.
Thanks for that. Thanks,
yeah.
Yeah.
And just a quick addendum before you get the next discussant, and in Tom's observation is a germ of an idea where, while you're reforming WTO, you can potentially have adjuncts like the digital service agreements and so on be developed outside and then come into the system, so you don't have to wait for the full reform before you incorporate them. But just starting from a completely new organization may be very time consuming and may not have the multilateral cooperation that it requires at this moment.
Yeah,
I agree with that.
Yeah, we've seen the difficulties in, you know, for example, with even TRIPS and GATT and so on. So it's best to probably develop it outside. Yeah, completely take that on board. Devika, can I get you in to make your interjection?
Yeah. So my questions are more about what can India do about all of this, and from the basic research that I did, I've realized that we do have a huge consumption market. So my questions are about, like, there are two questions. One is, will companies see the benefit of moving from a 18K per capita income country to a 7,000 per capita income country, for, like, if they want to create a new market? And second being that said, as Thomas mentioned, that mobile companies have seen the huge market in India as a reason to move here. Xiaomi produces 90% of the mobiles they sell here within India. So given all of that as a context, maybe our consumption market can drive people here, but is that even true? So that's my question. Like, what can we do about it generally, but specifically with our consumption market in perspective?
Tom, do you want to answer that generally in the sense of size of market, and then I'll go specifically on India?
Okay, well, I mean, I think it's clear that if India were to continue on the path of growth that's higher than it is now, but over the last, 20, 30 years, a decent size of growth, of course it's going to be attractive. And I think there, you know, US, European, especially manufacturing companies, are looking for new markets. And if we continue to go down a path of partial slow decoupling from China, then Western firms especially are going to be looking for these new markets. I mean, I like the example of the telecommunications sector, because India is already the largest market. It's not a hugely sophisticated market yet, but it's moving in that direction. And it's not only that you can produce lower end phones like Xiaomi, eventually India will move into the higher realms. And India has a fair amount of technological expertise that some of us have argued that Western firms should take advantage of. There's a technology in 5G called virtualization, sometimes called Open Radio Access Network, which avoids the vertically integrated suppliers like Huawei, where once you adopt their infrastructure, you're stuck with it. But open systems are much more flexible. They are based on software as much as possible, and cloud computing. India is a leader in that sphere, both in India and in the United States, where the leading systems integrators are very closely tied with Indian firms. So that could lead then to more production of the underlying hardware that goes into the system. So I just offer that up as, you know, one thing to think about. And you know, I'm getting ahead perhaps of the game, but for India and the United States and Europe, for that matter, to constructively work together.
If I could answer you, Devika, with a yes and a no. So I think the market is very attractive for all the reasons you mentioned, and for the generally upward trajectory in both real and nominal growth, and the increase in the demographic of the authorities, the people who actually consume in their 30s and 40s and so on. And so very attractive market. But the so-called attractiveness has to be a comprehensive package that includes a non-arbitrary use of the law, a non-retroactive use of the law, a generally simplified system of taxes that are not subject to arbitrary change, a unlikely or low probability of regulation changing with greater and lower intensity, waxing and waning, if you will, of crony capitalism. So we have to do sort of comprehensive thinking, rather than simply say that, you know, we've got, 500 million people who are going to be consumers today and tomorrow, and generally speaking, their, per capita income is going up by X, and therefore we're an automatic market. Yes, but you have to also operate in that automatic market. You have to then make profits in that automatic in that market. You have to then take out the profits to the extent you can to the equity holding is outside the country, and so on, right? I mean, you have to operate within a system that capital will encourage itself to show up here. But you can't just say we love capital to have a one-way flow, but in the reverse flow, we will put all kinds of impedance to that capital. We can do that, but then we have to take the other side consequence of that, which is that capital won't show. So I do think we can't think of it in isolation, but as Tom points out, I mean, Walmart's here, Vodafone is here, though very tenuously, and so on. And each of them is here and fighting it out in their own way, but they've all grappled with the inconsistencies of the Indian system fabulously. I mean, famously, as you know, with Vodafone on the retroactive tax issue, and now with a somewhat difficult implementation, perhaps correct implementation, but a difficult implementation of a judicial pronouncement that puts them pretty much at the verge of bankruptcy. And then similarly, as soon as Walmart arrived, there was another sort of very difficult change in law that made it very difficult for many e-commerce operators to operate. So those are just manifest example, but it's true for virtually any sector, any industry. And we need to get out of that syndrome if we are going to encourage people to come here and stay for the long term.
Thanks, Devika, for that. Actually, just before we get on to the next discussion, since there are a couple of at least audience questions which are deeply tied with the question that Devika asked, I just want to bring in audience questions in as well. So we've got Urvashi, for example, and Ashish, who's asked, there are challenges for India. Since you mentioned some of these things, which is about, the consistency in policy as one of the big aspects, but the other aspect is about, India's large and unorganized labor market. So, how do we deal with some of those things? And for instance, we saw a few of the Indian states doing some form of labor reforms, but those were, for a limited period, 3 years, and it was a blanket write-off. So is that enough? Is that adequate? How can India actually begin to attract some of the, companies that's moving out of China? That's part A. And part B is, can we also reduce our reliance in terms of not reliance on the company, but reliance on the raw materials that we get from China? So these are two questions that I thought was, kind of pertinent to the discussion that we are having now.
Should I go, Anupam?
Yeah.
So first, the reforms that the states have done with respect to labor in the recent past related to the pandemic are definitely unconstitutional, possibly illegal, and will be struck down. Dispensing 100% with labor law is not reform. That's the Wild West, and we are actually in the East. So that makes no sense whatsoever. And unlike the United States, the constitutional subsidiarity in India rests with the union, not the state. In the US, it's the other way around. If the matter is not addressed, it rests with the state. In India, if the matter is not addressed, it rests with the union. So under Section 242 of the Constitution, it will be struck down by the president, by non-signature, as it were, right? So there is no reform lurking in the shadows. The ordinance will die a natural death very soon. That said, there are four. There's a simplification of all labor laws into 4 labor codes. It's already in Parliamentary Standing Committee. And just like the newly released new national education policy, I think there are many elements of it which would definitely constitute reform in the labor market thing. So I would encourage those people interested in labor reform to actually look at those labor codes that are already doing the rounds in Parliament. And that will give a very good picture of how the consolidation, first, the elimination of laws that go back more than 150 years ago, and then second, how those have been consolidated into 4 labor codes. And that's likely to come into effect very soon in the next six months or so. The laws are less the problem in India. We do need better and more modernized law. But like most developing countries, particularly democratic developing countries, the difference between de facto and de jure is the bigger problem, right? The de jure laws are adequate, perhaps not in labor, but in many other instances are more than adequate. But the de facto implementation that includes crony, favoritism, and so on is the one that's the silent killer, so to speak, in the midst of a pandemic. I would just leave it there.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. So I'll just get into our next discussant in. Antara, are you here?
Yes. Hi. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here for this very important and enlightening discussion. So I have a very small question for the panelists. Being a China scholar and researcher myself, I see China is very concerned about this de-Sinicization or the anti-globalization trend that is catching up across the world. And they're also considering various countermeasures to offset this trend. For example, coming up with the foreign investment law, setting up various free trade zones, cutting down on the negative list for foreign investments, and so on and so forth. And now we have the 14th 5-year plan around the corner, and Chinese leaders have suggested a new development pattern with domestic cycle as the main body and domestic and international cycles mutually promoting each other. And they are also arguing that China's stable economic recovery expectations, its continuously optimized business environment, ultra-large market advantages, and domestic demand potentials are going to attract more and more foreign investments. Its media also says that foreign investment in China is actually not reducing, it's actually increasing. And, foreign companies are making outstanding profits in China as compared to the lackluster performances in their respective domestic market. So under such circumstances, to what extent do you think political will of nations can override or can triumph over economic logic or the economic incentives that China is planning to have? And of course, like everybody, what India can do to match up with the scale and speed of China's reform. So these are the 2 questions. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Thomas, I want to bring you in on this question. I think the broad kind of idea here is that it makes economic sense for a lot of the companies to invest in China. The rate of return, and at least going by what they publicize, and we can always put a question mark on the figures, but the rate of return in China seems to be higher than obviously a lot of other markets. And of course, one big aspect of that is just geographical proximity to the market, as we spoke about earlier. So irrespective of the political kind of narrative that we want companies to move out of China, is that actually happening? Will that happen? And how do you see that playing out?
Well, it's an excellent question, and I don't think we really know the answer. Let me give a couple of observations. I think it is true that certain industries present in China are doing very well. I know the US auto companies, the European auto companies have been doing very well. The heavy construction equipment industry, Caterpillar and the like, have from time to time done fairly well. Technology industries, less so. I mean, China is not an innovator in technology, really. But, they produce Apple products, they produce electronics. That trade is favorable to the United States because the value added, as I think Narayan alluded to, isn't largely in favor of the U.S. producers. Now, that being said, if you look at the surveys of business sentiment from the U.S.-China Business Council, which represents U.S. businesses in China, they've become increasingly pessimistic over the last 5 years especially. And that is because China wanted these companies in there to grow its economy rapidly, to satisfy consumer demand, but also to learn how to produce various products. I mean, if you will, some accuse the United States of having done this with the United Kingdom in the 19th century. There's a certain amount of truth to that, but anyway, the U.S. businesses are increasingly wary of producing in China because they see their the intellectual content of their production processes and underlying, patented or trademarked products being eroded, is a polite way to put it. So that's one way to think about this. The conditions are deteriorating, I think, for foreign producers in China. Now, the second part of the question was the growing Chinese market, and of course, with hundreds of millions of people in the middle class, the capitalist eyes grow wide and ravenous. But the Chinese economy, as I think we all know, is still run on the basis of not the consumer, but the producer. And that's why it's an export-oriented economy. And China, in their 5-year plans and speeches of Xi Jinping, assert that they are going to go to the domestic consumer economy is the engine of growth. They haven't achieved that yet, and they're far from it. I think the consumer sector in China is still below 50% of GDP. It's over 60 in India. It's over 70 in the United States. There's no doubt there's a huge market in China, and it's been beneficial, but it's not the nirvana that wide-eyed capitalists had thought, say 30 years ago when Deng Xiaoping opened China again. So those are my observations, if you will.
Thanks for that. So I have about 10 minutes, so I'll try and take about 2 or 3 audience questions. One of the questions, and I thought this is interesting in terms of the sequence, one of the questions from Sanjeet Kashyap is coming from an opposite direction that Antara came from, which is that if geopolitics is at the present moment kind of trumping economic considerations in the international political economy, what kind of policies do you expect the international financial institutions, such as World Bank and IMF, to endorse? Will it endorse the kind of openness, liberalization kind of narrative that it did in the 90s and 2000s, or will that tone change as well? That should do, with the movement of capital. So I thought that's an interesting question. And to Narayan, I'll follow up with one more on capital movement.
Sorry, is that to me or is that to Tom? I think you were addressing Tom, right?
Yeah, Tom. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that with regard to the World Bank and the IMF. They try to be even-handed in the way they operate. And unlike probably through most of their histories, they're not dominated as much as they were by the European axis. Perhaps look at the World Trade Organization as it's not a perfect example, but that is controlled, if you will, by broad coalitions that are political in nature, but they're not dominated by the US and Europe. In the private sector, I don't know if this is really what the questioner was getting at. In the private sector, what you're looking at, what is emerging in the United States, and I don't know how far this will go, but is a realization that China and China's growth is heavily dependent on foreign capital. I don't have good numbers at my fingertip, but China is becoming increasingly heavily indebted, and they're dependent on their internal real estate market for a lot of their budget, but also to foreign capital in general. And the critics of China are increasingly looking at access to global financial markets, which still are dominated by the United States and Europe, and thinking about ways to deny access for geopolitical reasons. And you can see this in calls for delisting of Chinese companies in the US stock exchanges because they don't, amongst other things, they don't adhere to international accounting standards. So the transparency for the investor is very poor, and that's an economic reason to deny access. But it's geopolitical thinking is behind that. And if I may, just one more comment, since this came up earlier. The United States and Europe, well, I maybe speak for the United States, are wealthy countries. And at a certain point, one can tolerate less economic efficiency if the costs of that economic efficiency tend to outweigh the benefits of economic efficiency. I mean, this is easier for a wealthy country than it is for a developing country, but one has to take that into consideration. And I think in the United States, at least, that sort of sentiment, people are aware of that and thinking more and more about it.
That's perfect, because it acts as a very good segue to the questions on capital markets and flow of capital that I have for Narayan. we were previously discussing about the complexities of global supply chains in terms of we really don't know where do the different parts of a particular component or a particular good comes from. It can only be a lot more complex in the world of finance. India went ahead and banned a few Chinese apps, but we are allowing others. And we really don't know where the financing of many of these apps come from and so on. So how much economic sense does it really make? Was it purely symbolic, or does that, in terms of just flow of capital, does that make any sense to try and limit, regulate and control the flow of capital from China into India? Or, and even the US has had stricter or trying to have stricter regulations in terms of Chinese investment into US tech companies. So does that make sense, Narayan?
Yeah, so now I'll get to the second half of the operative word in your title, which is economic. We spoke about divorce already. The word economic interdependence really applies not merely to trade, but to capital, talent, technology, possibly even resources, though you could tuck resources into trade, right? So you have to talk about all four of them. You can't simply talk only about trade if you even if you just limit the word to economic. Obviously, if you go to politics, it introduces all kinds of other things, but even the word economic is not limited to trade. It includes all. Now, there is an argument that as frictions in trade increase, it is actually somewhat likely that despite things like the ban on apps in India or CFIUS in the US and other things, that the actual capital flow around the world will actually increase. Because if you actually have to restructure the global supply chain, you will have to recreate capacity that already exists somewhere else. Maybe that old capacity will obsolete itself or will have a return on capital that goes to zero. But if you want to near shore to Mexico or to Canada, you have to build that facility there, as for instance, Taiwan Semiconductor is now doing in the United States. Its largest big plant will come up there now. So capital flow will, at least in the medium term, be equal to or greater than it was. For another reason, it will also be equal to or greater than it was, which is that we know that post the pandemic, global interest rates, particularly hard currency interest rates, are going to remain very low for very long. The Fed announced a major sort of paradigm shift only, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, that basically said, to hell with 2% inflation, we'll get there on average rather than specifically. So effectively what they've done is they've taken out any hard cap on inflation for the moment. So all it does is gives them the cushion to become even more relaxed about monetary policy in the future. So for all the trillions of dollars in Canadian, US, and Dutch and Australian pension plans, for them to get more than 1 or 2% of yield, they have to go somewhere. And despite the politics of it all, at the very least, it's going to leak. At best, it's going to go despite the politics. And so you will find global money sloshing around everywhere. And that money will find its way through FII, FDI, all of the instruments of global commerce that then facilitate sort of capital moving. I don't think you're going to get a serious interruption to global capital flow anytime soon. You will get the interruptions that we've had in India now, which is a direct, threat on the territorial borders. But perhaps as of this morning, that threat has at least declined a little bit. We'll see. But as that sort of fades, I think you will see a lot of it sort of re-emerge, not perhaps to the same extent as before, at least soon, but re-emerge it will. So I think global capital will. The talent one is a little bit more complicated, but again, in a world where employment is a primary determinant of political success, I do think people are going to find ways to allow for at least skill-based immigration like Canada has done or like Australia has done, and perhaps even wider than that. I mean, Tom can confirm this, but the agriculture sector in the US is in trouble because of the pandemic and the limited movement, but two, because of the extremely constricted mobility of the labor force that was entirely coming on a seasonal basis from Mexico, which has been severely impeded this year. So I think I'm going to put that in the labor force bucket or the talent bucket. So each one of these things will have some issues. Technology itself, and again, I'm no expert, we can talk about it, but that requires an entire new conversation. But technology itself may—
That's the next webinar, so don't worry about it.
yeah, that may go in two paths. I mean, two streams, right? One sort of a Chinese stream and a one non-Chinese stream. But everything else, I think, will have to find some sort of workable middle.
All right, thank you so much. I'm afraid we are out of time. That was, it kind of flew by. So thank you so much for to Thomas and Narayan for joining us as panelists for this webinar. I'm afraid, there are a lot of other interesting questions that I wanted to pose to you both, but in the interest of time, I think we'll have to skip that. But yeah, thank you for joining in. Thank you, Antara, Devika, and Ramya for joining in as discussants. I think you made very timely interjections. And of course, to all the participants here, it's a Friday evening, at least in Bangalore. Not that the pubs are open, but at least you still made it and you were patient enough till the end. So thank you so much. We have details of the next webinar on our screen, so you can check that out. That's on next Friday, the same registration process. Do join us for next week. Thanks once again, and have a fantastic weekend ahead. Thank you, Thomas. Thanks, Narayan.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.